The darkness over northern France began surrendering to dawn on June 6, 1944. Across the English Channel, an armada unlike anything history had ever witnessed cut through cold, choppy waters. Nearly 7,000 vessels moved in coordinated silence toward the Normandy coastline. The largest seaborne invasion ever conceived was about to begin. 200 miles away, deep inside a fortified compound in East Prussia, the man who could have stopped it all lay sleeping. Adolf Hitler, the dictator who demanded control over every military decision, who trusted no general's judgment but his own, who had built an empire on ruthless decisiveness, remained completely unaware that the fate of his Third Reich was being decided without him. His staff stood frozen in the corridors outside his quarters, faces drained of color, voices dropping to urgent whispers. Telephone lines had been burning for hours. Reports flooded in from the French coast, each more alarming than the last. Paratroopers falling from the sky, gliders crash landing behind German positions, warships emerging from the morning mist, their guns thundering against the Atlantic wall. The invasion everyone feared had finally arrived. Yet nobody moved toward the Führer's bedroom door. Nobody dared knock. They knew what awaited anyone foolish enough to disturb his sleep. Hitler's volcanic temper had ended careers, destroyed reputations, and in some cases, ended lives. The cost of waking him at the wrong moment could be devastating. So they waited, paralyzed by fear, while history unfolded on the beaches of France. The dictator's dangerous routine, understanding why Hitler slept through the most critical hours of D-Day, requires understanding the bizarre world he created around himself. By 1944, the Führer had retreated into a nocturnal existence divorced from the brutal reality of a war Germany was losing. His daily schedule had become a strange ritual his entire high command was forced to accommodate. Most nights, Hitler refused to retire until 4 or 5 in the morning. He would gather his inner circle in his private study, sometimes discussing military strategy, other times launching into endless monologues about architecture, art, his vision for post-war Europe, or bitter memories from his youth in Austria. These rambling sessions stretched for hours, with exhausted generals and advisors fighting to keep their eyes open while their supreme commander talked endlessly. When Hitler finally dismissed everyone and retired to bed, an unofficial but ironclad rule took effect. The Führer was not to be disturbed. Staff members walked on carpet rather than marble to avoid noise. Voices stayed at whispers. Even urgent military dispatches were held until he emerged naturally, usually sometime in the afternoon. This went beyond respecting someone's sleep schedule. Hitler's subordinates had learned through painful experience that waking him prematurely triggered explosive rage. Officers had been verbally destroyed for bringing news at the wrong hour. Some had been immediately reassigned to the Eastern Front as punishment. Others simply disappeared from their posts, careers obliterated in a moment of the Führer's fury. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations, once made the mistake of waking him for a false alarm about an enemy breakthrough. The resulting tirade lasted over an hour. Jodl, a hardened military professional who had served Germany for decades, stood at attention while Hitler screamed accusations of incompetence, cowardice, and betrayal. After that incident, word spread through the entire command structure. Unless Soviet tanks were literally rolling up to the compound gates, you let the Führer sleep. On the morning of June 6th, as the greatest invasion in human history crashed onto French shores, Hitler's staff made their calculated decision. They chose to wait. They chose to let him rest. They chose to preserve their positions rather than risk his wrath. And with every passing minute, the window to stop the invasion grew narrower. Hell breaks loose on the beaches while Hitler slept. Thousands of young men died on 5 stretches of French coastline that would become forever etched into history. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Each beach held its own story of terror, heroism, and unimaginable sacrifice. The first wave of American troops hitting Omaha Beach faced something approaching hell on earth. Landing craft doors dropped, and immediately machine gun fire tore through ranks of soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder. Men fell before touching sand. Others jumped into water over their heads, weighed down by 60 pounds of equipment, and simply vanished beneath the waves. The beach was supposed to have been softened by aerial bombardment. It hadn't been. German bunkers remained intact, their guns firing with methodical precision. Corporal John Ellery of the 16th Infantry Regiment later described those first moments as stepping into a slaughterhouse. Bodies floated in the surf. Wounded men cried out for medics who couldn't reach them through murderous crossfire. The water turned red. Equipment littered the beach, abandoned by soldiers who chose between their gear and their lives. Some units lost 90% of their men in the first 30 minutes. Further east, British and Canadian forces made better progress on Gold and Juno beaches, though at terrible cost. The specialized tanks they brought ashore, modified to swim through the surf, gave them crucial firepower Americans at Omaha lacked. But German defenders fought with desperate determination, knowing their survival depended on throwing invaders back into the sea. The German soldiers manning those beach defenses weren't elite troops Hitler kept in reserve. Many were older men, some not even German but conscripts from occupied territories. They hadn't been told this would be the day. They were as surprised as anyone. But they followed their training, manned their guns, and inflicted horrific casualties on attacking forces. Radio operators in German bunkers frantically transmitted messages back to headquarters. The scale of the attack was becoming clear. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't a probing action. The entire Allied war machine had thrown itself against the French coast. They needed help. They needed reinforcements. They needed orders. But orders didn't come. Not for hours. Because the one man authorized to mobilize Germany's most powerful reserves, the elite panzer divisions that could potentially drive the Allies back into the Channel, was still asleep. And nobody was brave enough to wake him. The terrible choice inside Hitler's headquarters, tension had become unbearable. General Wilhelm Keitel, head of the German High Command, stood in the operations room staring at maps being updated with increasingly dire reports from France. Every instinct he possessed as a professional soldier told him this was the moment. This was the real invasion. They needed to act immediately. But Keitel wasn't known for courage or independent thinking. He had risen to his position largely through his willingness to agree with Hitler on everything, earning him the bitter nickname Le Keitel among other officers, a play on the German word for lackey. If Hitler said the sky was green, Keitel would nod enthusiastically and praise his commander's insight. Standing beside him was General Jodl, a more capable officer but equally intimidated by the Führer's unpredictable temper. They looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Someone had to make the call. Someone had to take responsibility for either waking Hitler or continuing to wait. The clock showed 9:30 in the morning. The invasion had been underway for over 3 hours. Allied troops were off the beaches now, pushing inland, securing positions, beginning to link their separate landing zones into a continuous front. The critical window for counterattack was closing minute by minute. Jodl finally spoke, his voice carefully measured. They should wait just a bit longer. The Führer would be furious if they woke him for something that turned out less significant than they thought. Better to gather more information. Better to be absolutely certain. Better to let him wake naturally and then present him with a complete picture. It was a catastrophic decision, but in the twisted logic of Hitler's Germany, it seemed the safest option. The system Hitler created punished initiative and rewarded those who avoided risks. His subordinates learned to protect themselves first and worry about winning the war second. So they continued to wait, telling themselves they were being prudent, while the fate of Europe was being decided on Normandy's beaches. The awakening noon arrived, and finally Hitler emerged from his bedroom. His valet helped him dress in his customary plain military tunic. The Führer moved slowly these days. At 55, years of stress, a terrible diet, and a daily cocktail of medications prescribed by his personal physician had left him looking older than his years. His hands trembled slightly, a condition worsening for months. But his eyes remained sharp and suspicious as he made his way to the operations room. The assembled officers stiffened as he entered. Maps had been prepared. Reports had been organized. Someone would have to be first to tell him what had happened while he slept. That unenviable task fell to Jodl, who stepped forward and began his briefing with the careful precision of a man defusing a bomb. Allied forces had landed on the Normandy coast in significant strength. Initial reports suggested thousands of troops, supported by extensive naval gunfire and air cover. German defenders were engaged along multiple beaches. Casualties were being inflicted on both sides. The situation was developing rapidly. Hitler listened, his face unreadable. When Jodl finished, a moment of silence stretched out, heavy with anticipation. Everyone in the room waited for the explosion. They waited for Hitler to erupt in fury at not being awakened immediately. They waited for heads to roll. Instead, Hitler remained eerily calm. He walked to the map table, studying the marked positions with his hands clasped behind his back. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost dismissive. This was not unexpected, he said. The Allies had finally made their move, but this was not the real invasion. The officers exchanged glances. Keitel started to speak, to suggest the scale of the attack seemed quite substantial, but Hitler cut him off with a wave of his hand. Normandy was a diversion, he explained, his voice taking on the lecturing tone he often used when he believed others were failing to grasp an obvious truth. The real invasion, the main assault, would still come at the Pas de Calais. Everything he had seen in intelligence reports over the past months pointed to Calais. That's where the Allies had concentrated their forces. That's where General Patton was positioned. That's where they would strike their decisive blow. This Normandy landing, Hitler continued, was meant to draw German reserves away from Calais. It was a clever feint, he had to admit, but he would not fall for it. The panzers would stay where they were. The Atlantic Wall's strongest defenses would remain at Calais. When the real invasion came, Germany would be ready. Jodl tried again, more carefully this time. The reports from Normandy suggested this was a major operation. Perhaps they should at least move some armored units closer to the coast, just as a precaution. Hitler's calm evaporated. His voice rose sharply. Was Jodl questioning his strategic judgment? Did Jodl think he understood Allied intentions better than his Führer? The panzers would not move. That was final. The room fell silent. No one dared argue further. Hitler had spoken, and in Nazi Germany, the Führer's word was absolute law, even when that word was catastrophically wrong. The ghost army that never came to understand Hitler's disastrous certainty about Calais. You must understand one of the most brilliant deception operations in military history. The Allies called it Operation Fortitude, and it was a masterpiece of strategic misdirection that exploited every one of Hitler's psychological weaknesses. For months before D-Day, the Allies had constructed an entirely fictional army in southeastern England, positioned as if preparing to invade Calais. They built fake landing craft from canvas and wood. They created inflatable tanks that looked real from the air. They established dummy headquarters buildings and transmitted endless fake radio messages discussing non-existent troop movements and supply requirements. They even deployed General George S. Patton, whom the Germans considered America's most dangerous commander, to lead this phantom force. German reconnaissance flights photographed the fake installations. German spies in Britain, all of whom had actually been captured and turned into double agents by British intelligence, sent back reports confirming massive Allied preparations across from Calais. The deception was so thorough, so convincing that German intelligence believed every word. Hitler had studied the reports obsessively. He convinced himself that he understood Allied thinking better than his own intelligence officers. Calais made perfect sense as an invasion point. It was the shortest route across the Channel. It offered the most direct path into Germany. It was where he would attack if he were commanding the Allied forces. Therefore, that's where they would come. This confidence became an unshakable conviction. Hitler had poured resources into fortifying the Calais region. He had positioned his best troops there. He kept the elite panzer divisions within striking distance of those beaches. And when Normandy exploded into violence on June 6th, he simply could not accept that he had been wrong. His ego, his need to be the smartest person in any room, would not allow him to admit he had been completely deceived. Even as his field commanders sent increasingly desperate messages from Normandy, even as evidence mounted that this was indeed the main invasion, Hitler clung to his Calais theory. Days would pass before he finally accepted the truth. By then, the opportunity to throw the Allies back into the sea had long since vanished. The panzers that sat silent. Nothing illustrates Hitler's fatal stubbornness better than what happened with the panzer divisions positioned near Normandy. These weren't ordinary tank units. These were Germany's elite armored forces, battle-hardened veterans who had fought across Europe and the Eastern Front, equipped with the powerful Tiger and Panther tanks that Allied forces genuinely feared. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and the Panzerlehr Division were positioned within striking distance of the invasion beaches. If they had moved immediately when the landings began, they could have reached the coast while the Allies were still vulnerable, still trying to establish their foothold, still without the heavy equipment and reinforcements that would make them unstoppable. German commanders on the ground in France understood this perfectly. They could see what was happening. They knew they had a narrow window of opportunity. General Leogier von Schweppenberg, commander of Panzer Group West, practically begged for permission to move his tanks toward the coast. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, added his voice to the requests. Every experienced officer who looked at the situation reached the same conclusion. They needed to counterattack now with everything they had before the Allies could consolidate their positions. But Hitler had centralized military authority to an absurd degree. He personally controlled the reserve panzer divisions. Local commanders could not move them without explicit permission from the Führer himself. It was a command structure designed to prevent anyone from acting independently, from potentially threatening Hitler's power by commanding forces he didn't directly control. In most situations, this rigid hierarchy merely slowed decision-making. On D-Day, it proved absolutely fatal. Hour after hour, the requests came in. Hour after hour, Hitler refused. The panzers sat in their positions, crews standing by their tanks, ready to move, waiting for orders that didn't come. Precious daylight hours slipped away. The Allies brought more men ashore, more equipment, more artillery. They established supply dumps. They set up anti-tank defenses. They called in air support. By the time Hitler finally, grudgingly authorized the panzer divisions to move toward Normandy late in the afternoon, the situation had transformed completely. What could have been a crushing counterattack against vulnerable landing forces became a desperate attempt to stop an invasion that was already succeeding. And even that attempt was too late. Death from above. When the German tanks finally received permission to move, they discovered that the Allies had achieved something the Wehrmacht had never fully experienced: total air superiority. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, had been systematically destroyed over the previous 2 years. Germany simply didn't have enough planes left to challenge the massive Allied air presence over Normandy. As the panzer divisions rumbled toward the coast, Allied aircraft swarmed overhead like birds of prey. Fighter bombers dove repeatedly, rockets and bombs tearing into the tank columns. The panzers were forced to move only at night, hiding under trees and camouflage netting during daylight hours. What should have been a 6-hour drive became a multi-day ordeal. The 12th SS Panzer Division, which could have reached the beaches on D-Day if released early, didn't arrive in strength until days later. By then, the Allies had brought their own tanks ashore. They had established defensive positions. They had naval guns available to provide devastating artillery support. The German counterattacks, when they finally came, were fierce but ultimately futile. Individual German soldiers and tank crews fought with extraordinary courage and skill. They inflicted significant casualties on the Allied forces. They contested every field, every village, every inch of Norman hedgerow. But they were fighting a battle that had already been lost in the critical first 12 hours, when Hitler slept and then refused to believe what was happening. Allied pilots later reported that destroying the German tank columns was almost routine work. The panzers had no air cover, limited freedom of movement, and were trying to advance against an enemy that had time to prepare. One pilot described it as target practice. The elite armored divisions that should have been Germany's salvation became scattered, depleted forces that could slow but never stop the Allied advance. The general who wasn't there among all the failures and mistakes of D-Day from the German perspective. One absence stands out as particularly symbolic. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, Germany's most competent and respected field commander, wasn't even in France when the invasion began. Rommel had actually predicted this exact scenario months earlier. He had toured the Normandy defenses and immediately recognized their vulnerability. He warned Hitler repeatedly that if the Allies landed there, this could be the real invasion. He begged for more resources, more troops, more authority to position reserves where he thought they would be needed most. Hitler had dismissed his concerns. Frustrated by his lack of authority and exhausted from months of preparation, Rommel had done something he rarely did. He took leave to return to Germany for his wife's birthday on June 6. He planned to present her with a gift, a pair of shoes he had bought in Paris, and then use the trip to visit Hitler personally to make one more attempt to convince him to strengthen the Normandy defenses. He was home with his wife when the phone call came. The Allies had landed. Multiple beaches. Thousands of troops. Rommel's face reportedly went pale as he received the news. He immediately ordered his driver to prepare for the return journey to France, but he knew in that moment that the war was likely lost. The invasion he had warned about had happened exactly where he said it would, and he hadn't been there to command the defense. The drive back to his headquarters in France must have been agonizing. Rommel understood military operations better than almost anyone in the German high command. He could calculate in his mind what was happening every hour he was absent. The Allies would be establishing their beachheads. They would be bringing in reinforcements. They would be setting up their logistics. And the critical response, the immediate counterattack that might have thrown them back, was being delayed by Hitler's stubbornness and the command structure's dysfunction. When Rommel finally reached his headquarters, he found exactly what he feared. The situation had progressed beyond the point where a counterattack could succeed. The Allies were ashore in strength. The opportunity had been lost. Later, Rommel would become involved in the plot to assassinate Hitler, seeing clearly that the Führer's leadership was destroying Germany. The failed attempt would cost Rommel his life. The true cost of one morning by nightfall on June 6, 1944, the strategic situation in Western Europe had fundamentally changed. Over 156,000 Allied troops had landed in France. They had suffered approximately 10,000 casualties, including over 4,000 dead. The cost was horrific, particularly at Omaha Beach where American forces had faced the worst of the fighting. But they had succeeded. They held the beaches. They had pushed inland in several areas. They had achieved their objectives. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's supposedly impregnable barrier, had been breached. And critically, the Allies had survived the most dangerous moment, those first hours when they were most vulnerable to a concentrated German counterattack. That counterattack had never come. Not when it mattered. Not when it could have made a difference. Hitler's morning of sleep, followed by his afternoon of denial, had given the Allies the time they desperately needed. Every hour that passed without a German armored response was an hour the invasion forces used to consolidate, reinforce, and dig in. Within a week, the Allies had over 300,000 troops in France. Within a month, they controlled all of Normandy and were breaking out toward Paris. Within a year, Hitler would be dead and Germany would be defeated. The path to that defeat ran directly through the beaches of Normandy and the decisions made, or not made, on June 6, 1944. Military historians have spent decades analyzing D-Day from every conceivable angle. They debate tactics, logistics, intelligence operations, and strategic decisions. But virtually all agree on one point. Germany's best chance to stop the invasion was in those first critical hours. If Hitler had been awake, alert, and willing to trust his field commanders, if he had authorized an immediate armored counterattack, the history of D-Day might have been very different. We'll never know if Germany could have actually thrown the Allies back into the sea. The Allied plan was solid, their forces were well prepared, and they had overwhelming advantages in air power and naval support. But they were vulnerable in those first hours, and a rapid, concentrated panzer assault might have turned D-Day into a catastrophic failure rather than a triumph. Hitler's sleep and his subsequent stubbornness ensured that possibility was never tested. The aftermath, a dictatorship's delusion. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of this story isn't what happened on June 6, but what happened afterward. Even as evidence became overwhelming that Normandy was the real invasion, Hitler continued to believe for days that Calais was still coming. He kept substantial forces positioned there, waiting for an attack that would never occur. The ghost army of Operation Fortitude continued to deceive him even as Allied troops marched across France. When Hitler finally accepted that he had been wrong, he didn't acknowledge his mistake. He never admitted that his strategic judgment had failed catastrophically. Instead, he blamed his generals for not executing properly. He blamed his intelligence services for being deceived. He blamed traitors and conspirators for sabotaging his plans. In Hitler's mind, the strategy had been sound. Only the implementation had failed. This inability to accept responsibility, to learn from mistakes, would characterize Hitler's leadership for the remaining 11 months of the war. He would continue to overrule his generals, continue to make strategic decisions based on wishful thinking rather than reality, continue to refuse to acknowledge that Germany was losing. His subordinates learned that bringing him bad news was dangerous, so they began to hide or soften their reports. The entire command structure became infected with delusion and denial. The plot to assassinate Hitler in July 1944, just weeks after D-Day, was driven partly by officers who recognized that his leadership was destroying Germany. They had watched him squander the chance to stop the invasion. They had seen him refuse to face reality. They knew that as long as Hitler remained in control, Germany would continue down the path to total destruction. The assassination attempt failed, but it revealed how completely Hitler had lost the confidence of his own military leadership. The echo through history today, D-Day is remembered as one of the greatest military achievements in history. We remember the courage of the soldiers who stormed those beaches. We honor the sacrifice of those who died. We celebrate the beginning of Europe's liberation from Nazi tyranny. All of that is absolutely deserved. But there's another story within the story of D-Day. It's a story about leadership failure, about the dangers of centralizing too much power in one person. about what happens when subordinates are too afraid to speak truth to authority, about the catastrophic consequences of letting ego override evidence. Hitler's performance on June 6, 1944, is still studied in military academies around the world, but not as an example of what to do. It's taught as a case study in how leadership can fail at the most critical moment, how a leader's personal habits, psychological rigidity, and demand for total control can paralyze an entire military machine, how the fear of one man's temper can prevent crucial decisions from being made. The German soldiers who fought and died on the Normandy beaches deserved better leadership. The field commanders who understood what needed to be done deserved the authority to act on that understanding. The entire German military machine, for all its flaws and the evil cause it served, deserved a command structure that could respond effectively to changing circumstances. Instead, they got a dictator who slept through the most important morning of the war and then refused to believe what he was being told when he woke up. Those 6 words Hitler reportedly spoke, "This is not the real invasion," encapsulate everything that was wrong with his leadership by 1944. They represent a mind so convinced of its own genius that it could not accept contrary evidence. They reveal a leader so isolated from reality that he trusted his preconceptions more than the reports of men dying on French beaches. They demonstrate the ultimate failure of dictatorship, when everything depends on one person's judgment, and that judgment is wrong, disaster follows. The morning of June 6, 1944, changed the course of World War II and therefore the course of human history. Thousands of brave men secured that change with their blood on the beaches of Normandy. But they were helped in a strange way by the failure of their enemy's leadership, by a dictator who slept too long, believed too firmly in his own theories, and refused too stubbornly to adapt when reality proved him wrong. History was written on those beaches. But it was also written in that moment when Hitler woke up, looked at the reports of the invasion, and dismissed it as a diversion. In that moment of arrogant certainty, he sealed Germany's fate just as surely as if he had ordered a surrender. He just didn't realize it yet. The greatest invasion in history succeeded partly because of Allied courage, planning, and sacrifice. But it also succeeded because of one morning, one mistake, one man's catastrophic failure to see the truth that was unfolding before his eyes. That's the complete story of what happened when D-Day began, and what Hitler said that changed everything.